Hey, hello everybody. I can see that it's now midday, so I know we've got a fair few people that's probably going to still be joining us, but as we've now hit midday, I think we'll make a start because we've only got the hour. So first of all, welcome and thank you for joining today. For anybody I've not yet met, I'm Rachel Murphy. I'm the volunteer manager for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, and I'm based at Plant Life. Also, a big thank you and a welcome to Oli Pescott, who is joining us today from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology to provide this webinar and this session today on the uses of NPMS data in ecological research and conservation. I know Oli has been with the scheme and extremely involved in its design and development before it even became the NPMS. So we're really looking forward to this session. And it forms part of our sort of ongoing programme of events and training sessions for NPMS volunteers, but of course also welcome to anyone else joining wishing to find out more about the scheme.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for that introduction. And just to say, Rachel, if you do want to interrupt me to ask a question that seems that it needs asking immediately rather than waiting till the end, then that's perfectly fine.
Brilliant, will do.
Don't mind that at all. I will just try and go full screen. Brilliant. Okay, make sure. There we go. Thank you, Rachel. All set up now. Great. Well, yeah, thanks for joining at this on this beautiful day. Maybe some of you even out sat in your plots streaming this whilst you have your lunch and get on with your next bit of botanical surveying. But if you're not, then yeah, I'm sure many of you will be outside after this. So I suppose first of all I should say that although I'm giving this presentation, it's really on behalf of the NPMS partnership, Plant Life, BSBI, UKCEH and the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and we also receive support from DARA in Northern Ireland, or have done in the past. So thank you to all the partners, and of course thank you to all the volunteers, which will be obvious, from this talk and the context that couldn't have done any of this without the volunteers' hard work and effort in going out and recording their plots. So well, it's kind of my name there and me presenting. It's really a celebration of a real group effort, and thank you to Rachel and Plant Life for organising the webinar series, which has been a great success over the last few years. So without further ado, I'll get on with the talk. I've tried to put a fair amount of background to the scheme as well, so I apologise for any old lags who have heard some of the introductory material before, but hopefully there'll be some new stuff towards the end where I talk about some recent applications or uses of the NPMS data for ecological research and other purposes. And it was interesting actually putting this together, how much there has been over the years, and it was actually quite hard to fit all of it in. So I should say that if I don't mention it, it's not because it hasn't happened. There may well be other research applications or uses over the years that I've missed. I've just tried to keep it to half an hour, 40 minutes. We don't bore people, and so you can all get outside and enjoy the sun. So to take a step back in time and provide a bit more of the broader context, I'm sure many of you are kind of familiar with the broad trajectory of plant monitoring and distribution mapping and recording in Britain and Ireland over the 20th century. But perhaps the general theme, especially where volunteer natural history is concerned, is captured perhaps by this trajectory of kind of pre-1940 or Victorian, earlier 20th century local floras, where people just tended to note distributions in written form in terms of localities, and often just very summary distributions, very common species, only really going into detail for the rare and scarce taxa. Then of course the atlasing bug took hold with the first BSBI plant atlas in 1962, the resurvey towards the end of the 20th century, the new atlas there published in 2002, through a couple of other initiatives, putting that online in 2012, somewhat recherche hybrid flora in 2015. And then of course this year, I'm sure you've noticed the third national distribution maps, the BSBI Atlas 2020, but also obviously the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, which started in 2015 with some experimental years prior to that, and obviously still running going forwards. And they've obviously got different scopes and purposes that I'll talk about. Just to say, obviously the large scale distribution mapping, this is illustrated by the Parnassia plots on the left there, they've been very effective at capturing distributions at that 10-kilometer large scale nationally. You can see there how between those three atlases, the distribution knowledge is kind of infilled from new surveys and digitization of historical data, but it's also given us unprecedented insights into change at those scales. And that little graph there is the long-term trend from the Atlas 2020 for Parnassia, a kind of sad tale of loss, particularly in the lowlands, but now perhaps that's extending to its stronghold as well. So hopefully something we can do some things to revert. So that's a kind of broad scale picture. And of course, habitats haven't really been absent from this historically. There's always been an interest in the plants' associations with habitats, their communities, their niches at different scales, what environmental conditions they need to survive and thrive. And so this is just a bit of historical interest that I came across a couple of years ago now, which was where Max Waters at the Biological Record Centre, or the Cambridge Herbarium, was the focal point for the BSBI Atlas in 1962, was collaborating with others in designing that scheme at the time and talking about how the guidance could be put together, how the recording cards should be structured, what types of information should be captured. And there was this question about whether they should put the effort into asking people for habitat information. And there were some numerical codes developed. And here is a botanist, Hef Warburg, you may have heard of. It's a nature reserve named after him in the Oxfordshire Chilterns down at Bix, corresponding on that point about guidance for surveyors in terms of recording habitat in the field, how that would be codified on the cards and how that might be used. As it happens, that information was never really used in any kind of publication per se, at least in terms of national atlasing. It was continued in kind of BRC, Biological Record Centre type recording. You can see here a little screenshot from a 1977 pamphlet which listed those codes, which actually came from that, that first BSBI Atlas. The pink cards here, kind of individual record cards for rare and local species occurrences, and you can see those red arrows just point to where those codes have been filled in. So hedgerow or roadside habitat for Bromus arvensis there, and a sandy shore habitat for Eleochorus parvula and things like that. So this information was accumulated, but it often sat in filing cabinets and was used in expert species revisions in monographs and to inform kind of written accounts, but it was never in a form that was particularly useful from an analytical sense or from easily kind of providing to others. So it's long been an aspiration, but never really realized until the early part of the 21st century, when this project, which was actually a national survey of 2-kilometer grid squares, which was done on a systematic random basis. So in other words, a grid of these squares was laid across Britain, first surveyed in 1987, 1988, and then resurveyed in the early part of the 21st century. And working at that smaller scale of 2 kilometers did allow more to be said about the associations between species in terms of their occurrences in broad habitats, their communities, their co-occurrences at that scale, and also provided quite a reliable look at change at that scale because of that systematic random basis. And at the time, there was a little review at the end of that project from which this table is taken from chapter 10 in this book that presented this work. And it's a bit jargony, but along the top here, New Atlas, and these other abbreviations, one's for County Rare Plant Register, the Local Change Survey itself, and the Common Plant Survey is and the Countryside Survey, the fourth column along there. The Common Plant Survey, some of you will remember, was a kind of early plant life precursor to the NPMS and to wildflowers count in between those two surveys. And then the last column is National Vegetation Classification type surveys. So it's this overview of how the information that was being collected mapped onto these different categories in terms of being able to tell us things about species distributions, about broad scales, about changes in their distributions, about their abundances, by which is typically meant how their percentage covers or numbers of plants at small scales, and then also the same thing but for habitats. And you can see there was a gap that was identified that was saying, well, firstly, we don't really know anything about plant community change over time. That's the very last row of that table. You can see there are no ticks in that, and that red one there that's circled was just about this local change project being able to say something about broad habitat change over time at that, again, at that 2 kilometer scale. So not very finely resolved. So this work and others kind of highlighted that there was a gap, at least in kind of voluntary natural history area that could potentially be filled by asking naturalists to look at plant communities and abundances at smaller scales within habitats. And that's, of course, where we come in with the NPMS. So there was a report that Kevin Walker from the BSBI and others from Plant Life were involved in writing, which was about really an early scoping stage for the NPMS, thinking about what types of things might be practical to do across the UK in terms of recording plants within habitats. And it really highlighted these points that I've already mentioned about kind of national mapping at 10K. It's very good at detecting change where plants restricted to particular habitats are strongly affected. So if there's really a signal that can be detected at that scale, and we saw the example of Parnassia, grass of Parnassus, but also true of things like arable weeds. But the more subtle changes at very small scales are not so easily tracked. So there was this opportunity, or possibility, I should say, really, of establishing a robust surveillance scheme. As you can see here, the quote was to vastly improve the UK's ability to report on and respond to the state of the natural environment, and also to obviously to promote plants and habitats, plant communities at the same time. And the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, who are so good as to fund the NPMS, monies received through DEFRA and elsewhere, really said that that's what they wanted, you know, a long-term wild plant structured recording scheme, in other words, with some sort of statistical design underpinning it that's attractive and understandable, but whilst also contributing these reliable data so that we can understand how the environment's changing at those smaller scales. And so really, I suppose what underlies that is this main aim that's highlighted on this slide, in that although rolling out a scheme of this nature allows us to potentially ask many questions and to try and answer many questions, and also perhaps to do fundamental ecological research, but there has to be some sort of primary aim to focus on when we're designing the scheme. Otherwise, you know, you obviously get sidetracked down all sorts of byways and lanes that don't necessarily lead to a coherent whole. So the main aim was really these annual habitat quality indicators, which again relates to that desire for the scheme to be robust and reliable at that national scale, so that when we say things to policymakers or academics or conservationists, they kind of accept the evidence, or are more inclined to accept the evidence. And that has implications for the selection of the sites, what volunteers and surveyors do within those sites, but also we need to make it attractive. So I also say something about, you know, trying to make it accessible to different experience levels. And so the whole thing is that kind of final bullet point there about we need some careful design so that we have some indicators that we can claim are reasonably representative of what's happening across the area of the UK that we claim it represents. And so some of this you'll know, so I won't spend too long on, but we have this structure at the small scale where there's a systematic random grid to try and minimize plot placement bias, so people aren't only picking the very best bits of habitat or the nature reserves or whatever it might be. And we provide information such as these grids and the lines to help people to select those square plots or the linear plots, and some background habitat information that may or may not be correct, depending on where you are and how easily discernible the habitat is from satellite information. But we also tried to build in a certain amount of flexibility to this at the same time, because it's all very well having a perfectly designed scheme, but if it's a perfectly designed scheme that absolutely nobody does, it's really more of a thought experiment than a useful monitoring scheme. And again, some of you may remember this, but back in 2013 and 2014, we had various types of field trials. We sent out questionnaires to volunteers, and we had a workshop with some expert statisticians as well. And so we tried to build in both the volunteer perspective and the statistical rigor to the design. And the flexibility comes at a number of different levels. One of which is the flexibility in the number of and types of plots that you survey, the levels at which you record those plots, the number of surveys you do in a year, and things like that. But obviously there is some guidance. Again, it would be difficult to send people out and just say, do what you want, but here's some broad guidance. You know, we do have a protocol, but there's a recognition that it can be variable, and sometimes people will need to self-select plots or record a habitat that's not in the scheme, or change the level at which they're recording a plot over time, perhaps as they improve, or maybe they start recording a habitat which they aren't that experienced in. So there's a certain amount of flexibility built in. And we tried to make that design experience experimental as well, in a sense. So when we recruited volunteers for our field workshop, we did some experimental work where we gave people different approaches to plot placement in the field. This was done in Surrey, around Box Hill, if you know it. And we gave different teams of people different layouts. For instance, this particular experiment related to the placement of the square plots. One of them on the left, we targeted particular habitats. The one in the middle was totally random, which of course sometimes gives kind of clustered layouts, sometimes they look less clustered. And then the gridded one, which we finally went with. And so, you know, we tried to make decisions that seemed to be most easily understood by people on the ground. It was a bit less flexible at the 1 kilometre square selection level. And this creates a lot of challenges because obviously on the one hand, we want squares which represent the whole of the UK. And this point will come up later in terms of the applications and insights that we might be able to get from the data. But at the same time, firstly, we need squares available near where volunteers live on holiday or want to go. And we also wanted those squares to be representative of the nicer parts. Well, I say nicer. We wanted them to be representative of more representative semi-natural habitats, because the underpinning rationale is to monitor those habitats in preference to, say, the more average habitat types, which other schemes such as the Countryside Survey survey particularly well. So we came up with this national set of weightings, which basically means that squares are more likely to be surveyed if they've got larger areas of nationally rarer land cover types. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but I'll just point out really what that means by a couple of points on this map. One is, you might be able to see, if you know where it is, that Salisbury Plain is kind of highlighted as a very intense red block. That means we're more likely to put squares there, and that's because they've got their large areas of calcareous grassland, which are in the national context relatively rare, not absolutely rare, of course. The other thing is, in the fens, you might be able to pick out some coastal intense red dots, some kind of linear patterns of red dots if your eyesight's good, and that kind of picks out drainage channels and ditches in the fenland area, which again are kind of nationally rare in the context of this weighting, because they're freshwater habitats and they tend to be linear and therefore take up smaller areas, so they're kind of upweighted in this. So we're trying to send people to nicer areas as well, because it also makes the scheme more interesting for them. So that was another part of this. And then that plot B, the map B is kind of a random selection from that weighted surface. It's also been stratified by 100-meter grid. In other words, we kind of artificially spread it out so that hopefully there are squares near in each part of the country, but also nearer to where people live and work. So I'll skip by this because you probably know all about this. About another thing to make it accessible was to have different levels of participation in terms of broad or fine scale habitats. That has implications for the number of species that you're seeking, both in terms of whether you record at the broad or fine scales, but also in terms of whether you're kind of more of a beginner or an intermediate person. So that not only influences the number of species that you're looking for, but also the identity. So indicator species list tends to include a few more ferns and grasses and sedges, as you'll know, whereas the wildflower hopefully has a preponderance of species that are slightly easier to identify. And you know, we've taken steps to improve the guidance and cross-reference it to the habitat list as we improve the guidance, and also improve the habitat guidance between the first and second iterations of the handbook. We really improved the habitat descriptions and put in lots of nice photos. So we tried to make that resource broadly useful to people, so that they have confidence in identifying the habitats that they're in. And of course, that's not always easy, because habitats are not, when it comes down to it, necessarily always discrete entities, are they? They sometimes grade between types, or a kind of artificial pigeonholes that humans put things in. So of course, there's an acknowledgement there that there's always a bit of a gradient, and there's a need for some fuzziness where that's concerned. And of course, you know, as I already said, this can vary between plots, between visits. And there's also this inventory level where we ask people to record everything, regardless whether it's flowering or not. The same thing with the habitats. We also sometimes included some aggregates at different levels. So viola, you can record the aggregate of common and early dog violets if you're not sure how to separate them, or indeed you've got a hybrid population or something like that. So again, we're kind of always trying to think about how the data can be, or how the scheme can be made most accessible, whilst still making the data of ecological use when we come to interpret them. So really now the next part of the talk, the next kind of 15 to 20 minutes or so, is really about the data that we've got back and how we've been using that and what insights we're starting to glean from those. And I should say it's really kind of early days for this as well, because although we started the scheme in 2015, obviously it takes a while for word to spread, for the number of people to be engaged to increase, for different types of habitats to gain coverage, to get those repeat visits, in particular squares. I'm sure a lot of you look at the annual report and the newsletter that we send out. And there's a very nice feature in the, going to say it was the winter newsletter, but probably it was the annual report now. I think it was the annual report, wasn't it? It was the annual report. Yes, where we kind of interviewed a few people who'd been with the scheme for all 8 years and what changes they'd seen in their plots since then. That was really rewarding. And I'll come back to that at the end, because that's that kind of encouraging that close looking and attention to habitats and the landscape locally to people was one of the main motivating philosophies of the NPMS. Behind that broader research desire to create that national indicator, there was also a strong desire to kind of encourage people to look carefully and in depth, and to monitor their local environment and understand it more by going back to the same place year after year. And it's kind of hard to capture that from a research point of view sometimes. We kind of highlighted it in an early piece we wrote, which is available on the website, it's a PDF for British wildlife, making plants count. That's in the resources section if you want to look it up later. That's one of the things we said in there about, trying to promote that local engagement with people's environment. And it's kind of a different way of doing it to wandering around and surveying 1 or 2 kilometre squares and just creating checklists, which is obviously perhaps more of the traditional way that the BSBI and other recording organisations have approached the collection of distribution data. So we've now got lots of these data, plot locations, broad and fine scale habitat attributions for plots, these maps for relocation, but which also often include a lot of other interesting information that will no doubt be very, very valuable, say in 50 to 100 years, where people want to enhance or interpret, say, satellite photography or the Ordnance Survey maps of our era. A lot of these types of maps and photographs will have, crucial information for understanding what was there in the past. So I think we should always be also thinking about how these information are kind of capturing a snapshot of the countryside that will be an incredible historical resource in 50 to 100 years as well as the actual ecological information that we're capturing now. And I'm sure there'll be loads of things there that we haven't even begun to think about now, not just in these maps and illustrations that people have submitted and the photos, but also in things like the comments field. There's lots of gems about the landscape in those, and all the other management information that we're collecting about grazing and different types of habitat management that people observe. So this is the latest kind of count of habitat plots across the whole of the scheme. And these are, as you'll notice, at the broad level, not the fine scale ones. So these kind of add up all of the plots within a broad habitat type, counting all of the ones that are also at the fine scale. So it's kind of aggregating over all of those classifications. And the map there is just across all of these 1 kilometre squares across all of these habitats, just to show the broad distribution where we've had returns. And of course, there are thinner areas, as you might expect, in the uplands, the more remoter parts of Britain and Wales, fens, but they do tend to be places where we know from other schemes that it's hard to get coverage. And to be honest, we're doing pretty well, I think, in terms of not having huge gaping holes in the map of the UK. Britain and Northern Ireland, of course, is the coverage of the scheme, including the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. So, we're doing pretty well, and we're over 1,000 plots for broadleaf woodland, which includes hedges, and the lowland grassland, which is all the types of semi-natural grasslands, and quite a lot of the kind of second tier habitats, which are kind of either more regionally distributed, like arable margins, more in the the south and the east on the whole, in terms of the whole of the UK, bog and wet heath, obviously more in the north and the west, general in the whole of the UK. The coast, obviously a linear feature, so not going to be picked up as much by a random grid of random selection of plots. Freshwater, again, often of limited area in a square, often sometimes hard to access as well. Heathland. So even that second tier of habitats that are distributed in different ways, less than national, you might say, we're still doing pretty well and consistently, I would say, across those. And then, of course, the ones which are much rarer, habitats nationally or very spatially restricted, you know, we have a few fewer, so, you know, native pine wood, obviously, you know, but still, you know, still 50 plots on 70 plots for rock outcrops, you know, we're still doing pretty well there. I'm very happy with those numbers generally. And I think now going forward, it's kind of, you know, trying to get those plots revisited so that even if we don't have continuous time series for any individual plot, we can still kind of interpolate that environmental change or indeed stability in those areas from that information. So one of the key things I alluded to there is being able to say what's happened in those plots, even though we do have a lot of this flexibility built into the scheme. And that flexibility translates into gaps in the database, ultimately. That might be not necessarily gaps in terms of surveying, but sometimes gaps in terms of variability. So 1 year, a plot surveyed at the wildflower level, in 5 years, it transfers to a new surveyor retires or drops out, somebody new takes it on, and they're slightly more experienced, they pick it up at the indicator level. So then they're looking for a slightly different list of species. We can't always say that a species was absolutely absent from a plot, because if somebody wasn't looking for it using that list, we don't know. So then there's a certain amount of variation that we have to kind of build into any type of modeling or analytical work that we do. And one part of that is trying to estimate detectability of species. So have they been overlooked because they're at low abundance in the plot? Have they been overlooked because that grassland was only surveyed late in the summer and there'd been a drought, and therefore that early spring species had shriveled up and was unidentifiable, essentially? Or is it just that, you know, surveyor level has changed, etc.? So that's something we need to take into account, and particularly when we're doing these annual habitat indicators, where we're trying to get an idea of what the actual mean percentage cover was for a species within a certain habitat. So for instance, if we're interested in yarrow in lowland grassland plots, we need to be able to take all of those plots that had yarrow or might have had yarrow and work out whether they were present, absent. Sometimes we can extrapolate the absences from the fact that it wasn't reported, but they were looking for it. The surveyor was looking for it because it was on the list. Sometimes we don't know, and we just have to fill in those missing data from patterns established in other plots. And part of that is using these 2 or more, sometimes, surveys in a year to kind of estimate or correct for that overlooking of species. And this kind of plot, this cartoon, just illustrates the fact that there can be differences between that kind of naive occupancy, in other words, plot occupancy or plot frequency, and naive cover, and the truth if you had perfect data. And, you know, here there aren't that, discrepancies are not very large, but it's possible that across all plots and all species, there might be some systematic problems there that we need to take account for. So that's one thing that we need to think about. And that's kind of quite a large part of the analytical work that was done in the project, was trying to adjust for this so that the indicators were more reliable. I'll skip past this because it's kind of a little bit elaborate what we're doing here, but it's just to say that we're taking information on surveyor level, information that you provide on grazing, the cover that you record within a plot. We're using all of that information to try and estimate the probability that a species was overlooked, even though it was present. And we can use that information to kind of track back then to estimating a true presence or absence. We then combine that with the cover data that you provide, which is obviously varied across Britain and across habitats depending on their management. And then we use all of that information together to kind of estimate this underlying truth. Of course, you know, it's not absolute truth. It's a kind of statistical model truth that we think is reasonable based on all the information that you provide us with. But that's essentially what we do. We kind of take that information, propose that there's some sort of statistical model that we hope isn't too far wrong, and then use that to estimate the mean percentage cover. So that's how we can get to plots like these, which you may have seen. And these are the ones that were published in 2019 under kind of as a proposed experimental national indicator for 4 of the commonest broad habitats in the NPMS. So these are all examples of species listed as indicators within the lowland grassland broad habitat. So that's obviously covering all of the fine scale habitats, the dry calcareous, dry acid, damp neutral, lowland neutral grasslands. And what we have here, again, you might find it difficult to read the y-axis in these examples, but essentially the y-axis is just percentage cover, accounting for zeros across plots within that habitat. And I apologize if you don't like Latin names, so I'll go through them. So top left, we've got yarrow, and as I said, sorry, the y-axes do change between plots. So that's kind of stable across those 4 years, around about 5% cover. Top middle is Yorkshire fog. That's a bit more variable, but it's quite high cover, around about 20%, reflecting its kind of community, often community dominant nature. Wild parsnip, top right. Again, that's kind of low abundance, but quite a little bit, well, increasing a bit over the time series, perhaps in mean abundance, like 4%. And then we've got some kind of rarer species, you know, fragrant orchid, which wasn't recorded in the first couple of years. Bottom left, the arable sow thistle, again, quite low cover. And then a species there, hop trefoil, bottom right, that we think may have increased in a drought year there in 2018, done quite well in gaps in grasslands, which might be something that we begin to see more of and begin to be able to detect more easily within the NPMS. With increasing climate change, which I'll come on to. So ultimately, we can combine all of those species, and that's just basically taking a mean across those lines and saying this is what the average indicator species or positive indicator species in lowland grassland is doing. And so we can come up with something like this. And obviously, the value of this is somewhat limited with short time series, but as we get to, you know, the 10th anniversary, which is coming up for the NPMS in a couple of years, and then beyond that, you know, once we get to the point where, say, the UK Breeding Bird Survey is, or the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme is, with 50 to 70 years of data, then, you know, these will start to be incredibly valuable for tracking these changes within communities, and of, you know, and of course at the species level as well. Not just at these kind of aggregate levels. And that was in 2020, it says there. I think we first published them in 2019. That was the first time that an annual habitat indicator, C7, sorry, it's just the jargon within the UK biodiversity indicators. That's the first time it was being contributed through volunteer efforts. That was an amazing achievement just within 5 years for the NPMS. And as I mentioned earlier, we presented those for the 4 most widespread widely surveyed NPMS broad habitats there. And again, it's the same thing. The numbers in brackets there after the name of the broad habitat show the number of indicator species averaged over in each case. And those all had pretty good national coverage relative to the habitats that we were talking about, you know, particularly arable, broadleaf woodland and lowland grassland. You know, we're doing pretty well in terms of having a reasonably representative picture, although of course we can always do better there in various ways, both at broad and fine scales. So that was kind of what went into your plots and samples, which went into those indicators. And maybe you can pick yours out if you have one of the more remote locations and know you've surveyed one of those habitats. So of course, you know, looking at percentage cover is one way of doing it. It's not the only way of doing it. And we mentioned, I think in the summer newsletter last year or a couple of years ago, no, sorry, winter 2021, we put a little feature piece in the newsletter about indicators and what they mean. And of course, you know, any given indicator is an abstraction that can be useful for answering some things, but on the other hand, can kind of make other questions harder to answer. And so, you know, I don't want to give the impression there's only one way of looking at these data. There are many ways of looking at them. And this was another way that we just put in the annual report. And so this is looking at just counts of positive and negative indicators across broad habitats per plot and the distribution of those just for that year's data. You have to take into account here, so we've got the positive indicator species on the left and the negative indicators on the right. You have to take into account that the x-axes are different scales to compare these. So you'll see that the indicator species plot on the right has a much shorter scale. So the maximum there is only up to 6 species, whereas on the left it's up to 12. But if we take that into account, you know, a few interesting patterns that come out of this, you know, one of which is that arable field margins is one of the few habitats where they're consistently or quite often more negative indicators than there are positive indicators. You can see that there by the distribution of plots is projecting out in a kind of similar way, but maybe it's not greater, but it's a kind of approximate one. Whereas I think in most of the other cases, it's not, if not all of them, the negative indicator, number of negative indicators per plot that have been recorded tend to be fewer. Sometimes it's quite a striking difference. So with native pine wood there, you've got, tending to have a few more, always more positive indicators than negatives per plot. And maybe that's a side effect of the way we define the positive and negative indicators in those cases. So it's definitely something where it would warrant a more in-depth look at these going forwards. Another one with a similar pattern is bog and wet heath, where we tend to almost always have more positive indicators than we do negatives. And again, that's probably because those positive indicators in those cases are far more characteristic of that habitat and quite widespread, whereas the indicators perhaps are spatially restricted and only having very limited impacts in those habitats. But hopefully, ultimately we could link some of this information to the percentage cover, maybe get an idea of how those two things interrelate or don't. So the next few slides, I'm going to talk about a paper that we've got coming out next week, the end of next week or the beginning of the week after, which looks at a separate question about how well the NPMS plots and samples that we currently have sample a national gradient of climate change exposure. And this is something where we hope to take these data and the kind of information products that we've developed off the back of this research and have much more of a conversation and engagement with volunteer surveyors going forwards. I'll explain what I mean by that in the next couple of slides. So this is just a background slide, really. This slide doesn't contain any NPMS data. On the right-hand side there, we've got the national UKCEH land cover map, which basically is what it says. It's a national map of the habitats listed there, or the broad habitats and land cover types, really. And they kind of underpin some of the information that you get given as a surveyor in some areas, such as the predicted habitats on your 1 kilometre maps and things like that. And what we've done in terms of looking at climate change in NPMS, or likely climate change in NPMS plots, is to take climate data for the UK. Now, the UK is exceptional internationally in terms of the length of its observed time series and the sophistication of its modelled outputs for the future. And so we're extremely lucky, and we have climate data, going back to the 19th century and even beyond now, I think, in terms of things like annual precipitation, seasonal precipitation, annual temperature maximums, seasonal temperature maximums, minima, things like that. And we can take all of this information, which is what we did, and come up with an index of climate change exposure. What that means really is we're just taking all of those metrics, intuitive things that I've just mentioned, like, maximum summer temperature, annual precipitation. We're putting all of those into an algorithm and combining them and coming up with a degree of change that any given location in the UK is likely or has experienced in terms of the history, UK in terms of past time periods, or is likely to experience. And so this climate change exposure metric integrates all of these things and basically says how different is the climate going to be or has become in any given location. And that difference or exposure, as I say, integrates all of those things in terms of rainfall and temperature. So, we often end up with broad gradients relating things like warm, dry winter climates in the southeast, the kind of mild, cold, cooler summer, wetter winters in the northwest, and things like that, kind of intuitive gradients of temperature and climate that you'd expect in the UK. But one of the things we looked at was the changes between time periods, and that's what those 4 maps on the left just show there. That's the kind of intensity of change that any given location would experience between the time periods listed. So you can see there that the historic change for any given location between the first 30 years of the 20th century and 1961 to 1990 was fairly small and wasn't particularly much spatial pattern to it. The second time period comparison, the last part of the 20th century to the 2010, 2019, it's increasing change, and the spatial pattern in terms of the northwest southeast gradient seems to be becoming more apparent. And then that kind of really exaggerates as we compare the the recent observed data to the first modeled period, which is bottom left, and then even more so when we look at the near future to the far future, where the magnitude of climate change is much greater, and it's much more spatially patterned in terms of the southeast. And so this has implications for change in terms of obviously habitat change, but also difference between habitats, some habitats themselves having spatial distributions that then interact with these climate change exposure gradients. This is just another way of looking or visualizing these data. And really what the most interesting thing here is perhaps the modeled predictions for 2021, 2040, and then 2061 to 2080 on the far right. And that kind of muddy brown and the yellow and muddy brown relate to new climate types that we've not experienced really in the UK before, which are expected either now or in the near future to become much more prevalent. So that muddy brown is a climate type that's kind of dry summer, warm summer type, which is historically more prevalent in northwestern France. And then the yellow type, which basically covers the whole of the southeast in the 2060 to 2080 period, that's a climate type which is currently much more characteristic of the Mediterranean and the Iberian Peninsula. So that just kind of perhaps gives a more intuitive idea of the types of climate change that we're expecting, and allows us to relate it to kind of areas that we probably know from holidays or documentaries or whatever. And of course, maybe that we see when we go out now, when we're surveying our dry grassland habitats and things like that. And we're starting to think, well, it's starting to look a bit more Mediterranean in terms of this grassland becoming more patchy, and annuals or winter annuals and things, flourishing in gaps in the grassland in the early spring, and then being frazzled or toast by July, that kind of pattern. So what we did with this information was we looked at a number of different monitoring schemes in the UK, including the NPMS, and took that information on your NPMS plots and kind of intersected them with that land cover map and also with that climate change exposure gradient. And this both allowed us to say how well does the NPMS sample those gradients. And the important thing there is that if we're going to use NPMS data to say something about climate change and its effects on any given habitat, then we need to be sampling a representative gradient of that habitat so that we're sure that we're not just oversampling some plots that have a very unusual type of change, or indeed ones which are stable, which is also unrepresentative. So it allows us to be more confident when we start to say things like, well, we're pretty sure this observed metric from the NPMS in dry calcareous grassland is representing the impacts of climate change insofar as it maps onto this gradient, this empirical or indeed model gradient of climate change in the UK, which really supports us from the NPMS when we're talking to policymakers and producing those indicators. So this is a somewhat complicated chart, but I can talk you through the top right-hand cell, the one that says calcareous grassland. The bottom field distribution there, which is kind of filled in with green with a white dot in the center, that's the result of taking that land cover map, the calcareous grassland in the land cover map, and randomly sampling it, and then grabbing those randomly sampled climate exposure gradients. So that's a kind of distribution of the climate change exposure across the whole of the UK calcareous grassland as it was in 2019. And then what we did is we looked at the NPMS plots and the other schemes, the Countryside Survey, a couple of other Natural England sponsored schemes, and looked at how well those plots sampled that gradient. And so that purple line, purple squiggle that says 66%, that is and the number of plots, 218, that's an indication of how well the observed distribution of your plots within calcareous grassland within the NPMS overlapped that random sample of calcareous grassland, which is kind of a representation of its true exposure to climate change insofar as we've been able to model it. And so there we've got NPMS plots covering 66% of that gradient, which is pretty good. It allows us to be quite confident that if we're going to start saying things about changes in NPMS calcareous grassland plots, that insofar as they might relate to climate change, we'll probably be quite confident that there is more confident there is a reasonable link there. And one of the reasons to do this also was to kind of direct our future research. So the next stage is to say, okay, so we've got excellent coverage in acid grassland, in arable margins, broadleaf woodland, calcareous grassland, just to go along that top row there in terms of large percentages for the NPMS in purple, 77% for acid grassland, for instance, and then direct our focus on your plots so that we can start, say, looking in specifically to answer questions about the impacts on those plots. So this is a really kind of profitable line of research for the NPMS and will hopefully allow us to communicate findings in those areas quite soon. And I said about future conversations about these things with NPMS volunteers, and those two layers that I mentioned, I'll go back to them. So this one, these climate classifications and our kind of overall maps of climate change exposure. What we hope to do in the next year or so is to make that information available on the NPMS website as well, so that you can extract those metrics for your squares, for your plots, or for anywhere else you're interested in, your garden, for instance, or somewhere you go on holiday, so that you could kind of place your plot and your square and your locality in that national context. So we're quite excited about making that information available. I should say we've also published those data sets openly, so anyone can take those and use them for research. So the last couple of examples are not things that the NPMS partnership has done, because we spend a lot of our time running the scheme, and we're not necessarily directly funded to spend large amounts of our time doing novel research, but we make your data open so that everyone can pick them up and use them for a whole range of applications. And the final 3 slides just outline some of those things that maybe you can, if you're interested in, you can go away and look at. So the first one is this land cover map training, and this is a product from the Natural England, Living England map. And they've basically taken a whole load of habitat data and used it to train or educate an artificial intelligence algorithm, essentially, to then classify satellite imagery and create these kind of national habitat maps. So your plot labels, whether they're broad or fine scale habitats, have been used to link to an underlying satellite imagery along with lots of other habitat information, so that they can then create these national maps. And those are just examples given from Natural England there. That's not my text, that's just text I've taken from that blog. And this information, again, perhaps we'll make it available through the NPMS website, but it is already publicly available through the Magic portal, which some of you may be familiar with. So again, this is quite a fun thing, and you can kind of fade out the habitat information and look at it against a backdrop, as I'm sure you're familiar with, as online tools tend to do. And it's perhaps a quite nice complement to the existing information for your 1 kilometre square in terms of new information about semi-improved grassland. And this product seems to be particularly good in that regard relative to other land cover maps that have been available in the past. So that's, again, a very nice and open application of the NPMS data that you've submitted. A similar type of application, but a bit more abstract. This was done by colleagues at UKCEH Lancaster, and what they did is they took again, the plant community data from the NPMS, and this is not just the habitat labels, but the actual species information and their abundances, and linked it to other data, actually the same monitoring schemes that I mentioned in terms of the climate change exposure piece that we did. And they've then created a statistical model of the attributes of those species and created national maps. So when I say attributes, I mean plants are often, characteristics of plants, attributes of plants are often used to indicate features of the environment. And to that end, certain plant species have certain metrics associated with them. In the case of these so-called Ellenberg numbers, they tend to be, they're used as indicators of these things that I've listed there: fertility, soil pH, moisture, light. So if you have more species with higher Ellenberg N fertility numbers, typically you have a plot that indicates more fertility. That could be things like nitrogen, phosphorus, but it's also soil moisture, etc. It's not just about nitrogen, which people often take N to mean. So it's a general measure of fertility. And with all that NPMS abundance, species abundance data, these researchers were able to take that and create a national map of plant community fertility by integrating all of those data sources and using that abundance information associated with those species traits. And it's great to see that these maps are openly available as well for researchers to use. So again, these have only just been released last year, so I'm not aware of any actual applications of these just yet, but I'm sure there will be. And again, that's down to your hard work in collecting those plant community data at small scales to enable these kind of brand new extrapolations of this type to be made. There have been other uses, which I won't go into in great detail because I'm running out of time, but they've been used, and also some of these are quite involved, so it would take probably a seminar of itself to describe what's been done. But just to list, they have been used to look at agri-environment scheme impacts, where farmers have been paid to promote biodiversity, or at least not to harm biodiversity in various ways. They've been used to contribute to assessments of how brownfield sites, ex-spoil sites, for instance, in certain landscapes support biodiversity. They've also been highlighted as a resource for modeling plant communities nationally in a kind of similar way to those plant indicator maps we just saw, but more relating to actual plant communities in terms of named associations of plants, like some of you may be familiar with through the National Vegetation Classification. And as I've said, we try to make our data as accessible and user-friendly as possible to promote their use in research. And your species records, of course, also go to the NBN. We share them with the BSPI. And they're also shared through global portals, so that often when people, say researchers in other countries, download global data sets, your occurrence data from the NPMS are included in those. And if you went on to GB, if there was a link in the annual newsletter for the newsletter for the NPMS showing this, that you can kind of look at research reports that have used those data as well. So finally, as I mentioned very early on in this talk, we are, one of the things that really excites us is when people contact us and tell us about actual change in their plots. And we featured this as I said, in the annual reports, but also in terms of the newsletters. These are just some excerpts from where people have sent in that information in the past. That's fascinating because it allows us to contextualize the kind of abstract statistical analyses that we do on the data, and it will be increasingly useful as we, look, say, for instance, at plot photos, at the comments that we've received, and we can start to kind of support those national trends with local examples where people have, been monitoring their plot for years in their parish and can tell us exactly what's happened and why, and whether or not, the national signal that we've picked up parallels their local experience. And something maybe in some cases it won't, and that'll be equally fascinating. So I just end by saying thank you to all the volunteers, of course, and as I said at the beginning, it's not just me or UKCEH, it's the full NPMS partnership, and thank you all to you for listening. I'll let Rachel come back in and ask me if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Oli. That was absolutely fascinating, actually a little bit inspiring now. I kind of want to get out and go and get on a plot. I wondered if anybody, let me have a look, we've got about 7 minutes. If anybody has any questions at all to pose to Oli, now is certainly the time. You can see that I've popped in the chat there, I've popped a link to our latest annual report. I've also popped in a link to our latest newsletter. I know Oli mentioned a couple of times that there are some really useful references and links within our newsletters, so please do feel free to take a look at those as well. So I actually had a question for you, Oli. I'm really excited to see the latest paper on climate exposure coming out at the end of the month. The NPMS is clearly really well placed to examine how climate change has affected the UK's plants, especially with respect to abundance, and it clearly complements the other schemes and the surveys. But I wondered sort of what you think may come next as a result of that study. So what questions did this study undoubtedly raise? For example, could we look at assessing the responses of British plant communities to climate change, perhaps whether communities with different levels of exposure to change differ in their sort of direction or magnitude of their responses?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose a key thing that I glossed over was that obviously the amount of community changes is also, it's not just the property of the exposure to the climate changes which it experiences, but also it's a property of the community itself. Some communities are far more resilient to change. So as you say, similar communities that have a similar exposure to climate change nationally might change in quite different ways because of that. Also, obviously, some communities, like woodland being an obvious one, are somewhat buffered. So, having a canopy of trees above you makes a difference to the actual experienced climate on the ground. And of course, as can the management have big effects. But I think the thing I'm most interested in, or most excited by exploring, is we've got that excellent coverage of calcareous grasslands across different types across Britain. We know that that's one of the most exposed types, not just in the southeast, but across a whole swathe of Britain. And, just I'm sure lots of people see this, but, when we're walking around looking at grassland, there's definitely a pattern of grassland becoming patchier and different types of annuals becoming more prevalent in gaps in that grassland. And, that kind of seems to represent a real Mediterraneanization of our grassland. And there are lots of interesting questions there, not just in terms of that shift, in terms of perhaps certain types of perennials to porciennials or annuals, but also in terms of non-native species moving into those habitats. One of the things the national distribution maps from the BSP Atlas showed was that lots of non-native species spreading under climate change in urban and suburban environments. And there aren't that many cases where they've then spread into semi-natural habitats in a kind of big way. Obviously, there are exceptions to that, and particularly in grassland and heathland and things like that. So it'd be interesting to see whether there are any kind of annual or short perennials, short-lived perennial or porciennial species who are starting to make that shift into those gaps as they open up because of drought impacts.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I've got another 2 questions. I'm going to try and quickly get through these before our time runs out. So first one, Oli, are you able to please unpack what's meant by plant community fertility?
Yeah. So in the case of that that example I gave, if you imagine your plot in the field and you lay out your quadrat, that's composed of however many different species at different abundances. Those species will have been assigned trait values by ecologists in the past or recently. And in that particular case, species have been assigned for Britain a fertility metric. But that's basically just an ordinal scale between 1 and 9 that ranks species according to their association with fertile environments. So species that typically occur in more fertile environments, and that is the kind of common or garden sense of fertility in terms of highly productive. So lots of biomass, lots of competition, by virtue of which it probably means they're not in stressed environment, so there'll be adequate amounts of water, the soil fertility will probably be quite high, and so they can reach high biomass. So species that tend to be associated with those environments will be assigned higher numbers on that scale. If you've then got a plot of X species, you can take those numbers that have been assigned to those species, weight them by their abundance, and then create a kind of number for that plot, which would then allow you to rank plots in terms of their relative fertility. So a plot with a greater abundance of species that prefer fertile environments would be ranked higher than one which has almost no species of fertile environments. Say it's very infertile, say like, I don't know, dry calcareous grassland that's not typically very productive, in that sense, would then be ranked lower. So it's kind of that, fertile ruderal plots composed of ruderal, quick-growing species that would tend to be ranked more highly. So that mapped output that we saw kind of maps those areas where, at a 1 kilometer scale at least, this kind of gets a bit abstract because it's kind of average across that square, but it tends to mean that the landscape's more composed of fertile environments than otherwise. Obviously, at a very small scale, there's variation, but in terms of an average, that's what that means.
Okay, thank you. Another good question. Are you able to point us to any key references on the use of NPMS in assessment of agri-environmental schemes? Is that something you're able to do?
Yeah, the one that I mentioned, which I said would require like a separate webinar in itself, I'm fairly sure that is referenced within the resources section of the NPMS website. So if you go to resources and then conservation and research.
Yes, it is conservation research.
Yeah, there is a link to the DEFRA research report, which did that work. That's the one I'm aware of in 2018. It was in an appendix. That's quite a lot of information in that report. It's a huge report, but there's an appendix that looked at comparing NPMS plots to countryside survey plots in such a way as to try and get at the impacts of agri-environment schemes.
Real.
I'm almost certain that's on the conservation research
Yeah,
section
I
of the
think it
NPMS
is.
website.
If it's not, that's a good reminder for us to probably put it on there.
Yeah, well, we can check
That's really helpful. I've also been asked, is historic data available to the general public and government bodies to assess change over time for particular sites or particular habitat types, such as salt marsh, for example? And if so, where would that be held?
Well, that's quite a broad question.
Yeah.
The answer is yes, but it depends very much on the habitat. So this is something else that's linked from the NPMS resources page, but I'm mentioning it here in a very general sense. So the Environmental Information Data Center is the data portal that hosts NPMS data. Within that portal, there's lots of other data from specific projects. I'm 95% certain that there are historic salt marsh projects that have their data hosted on there. So
should be able to see Sam has very helpfully put the link
thanks,
of the
Sam.
Environment Information Data Center on the chat there.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously those data will result from projects of varying scope and national focus. So whether or not it's it's surveying sites that are relevant to your question is another matter, but certainly on the whole, spatially explicit data is available for lots of habitats, but it depends on what happened in the past as to what's available now and what's been digitized. I suppose what I'm saying is true of plot data. Obviously, if you want broad distribution data, say 1, 2 kilometer, 10 kilometer, then obviously we have the BSBI distribution database and the NBN. For the former, you need to contact the BSBI if you think there are data that are not publicly available that you'd like to look at.
So I can see now we're running over 1 o'clock. I've just got one sort of last question, but that's something that hopefully we can resolve after, is regarding sending the link to the Jarvis 2022 work on the gridded estimates.
Yep.
Wellenberg values.
Yeah,
so
we'll put that on. That's not on the
that
website, but we can put that on the website.
Yes, so that's what I was about to say. We can certainly find a way of making that available on the NPMS website as soon as possible. And that's it, I think, and that's perfectly timed because I can see it's now 3 minutes past 1. So thank you ever so much, Oli, for really interesting. Lots of thanks as well in the chat for a really interesting webinar, and thank you very much for everybody for joining.
Yeah, thanks, and obviously send us questions to support at NPMS, etc., and keep in touch, because as I say, it really is interesting to see the actual stories that volunteers have to tell of their plots, even if that's no change, because that in itself is really interesting as well, relative to what we might expect. So
we absolutely love receiving your updates, your news, how you're getting on, images, and any change or not, as Oli said, within your plots. We absolutely love to hear it. So as Oli said, our email is support@npms.org.uk, and similarly, if you've got any questions that you haven't thought of quite yet, but you'll go away and you'll put the kettle on and you'll think, oh, I wish I asked that, do send the question in by email and we will get back to you. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I shall leave you all to your lunch. Thank you.
Cool. Well, enjoy the outdoors.
Yes, enjoy the outdoors. And I'll put this up on the NPMS YouTube channel in due course as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
No worries. Thank you. Bye-bye.